ant is a machine built for conquest. A single colony holds 500,000 workers, a single queen lays 1,500 eggs a day, and together they hold 30 million acres of Texas. They kill newborn calves and swarm the sick in their beds. They send 80,000 people to the emergency room each year and cost the state over $1 billion. For 40 years, no poison or bait has stopped them. And then, in a handful of quiet pastures, they simply began dying, with no one treating the ground. Something had come back for them. The ant that could not be stopped. The fire ant may be the most successful invader ever to reach North America, and they do not behave like a normal insect. A single mound is not one colony of separate ants at all, but one creature made of hundreds of thousands of bodies, thinking and acting as one, with a single goal to take more ground. Scientists call a mound like this a superorganism. Pour water on it, and the ants lock their bodies together into a living raft that floats for weeks. Tear it apart, and it rebuilds itself overnight. Fire ants now cover around 30 million acres of Texas, packing some pastures with 100 or more mounds on a single acre. When they move in, they take over completely, and when their mound is touched, they boil up out of the earth in seconds, swarm over an animal, and sting all at once on a shared chemical signal. The damage is not small. They kill newborn calves and fawns where they lie. They swarm ground-nesting birds. They crawl into electrical boxes, drawn to the current, and short out the equipment inside. Cattle learn to avoid whole sections of a field rather than risk the mounds. Add it all together, and fire ants cost Texas more than $1 billion every single year, and send tens of thousands of people to the hospital on top of it, and nothing stops them. For 40 years, people have thrown everything they had at these ants: broadcast baits, mound poisons, growth regulators, contact sprays, and every method ends the same way. The ants in the treated patch die, and within a season or two, new colonies pour right back in from the land around it. So, the question that should stop you is this: if 4 decades of chemistry could never turn the tide, then what exactly started killing fire ants in 3 Texas pastures with no chemicals at all? The answer begins with where these ants came from and what they left behind. The invader with no enemies. The red imported fire ant is not from Texas. It is not even from North America. It came from the wet floodplains of South America, and it arrived here by accident, slipping into the United States through the port of Mobile, Alabama, sometime in the 1930s, most likely stowed away in soil used to weigh down ships. By the 1950s, it had reached Texas, and once it did, it discovered a paradise. But here's the thing about a species living in its native home: it is never really alone. Over millions of years, everything around it evolves to feed on it, infect it, or fight it for space. Back in South America, the fire ant was surrounded by a whole army of natural enemies, parasites that hollowed it out, diseases that swept through its colonies, and rival ants that fought it for every scrap. That constant pressure held its numbers down and kept the fire ant in balance, one tough species among many rivals. And back in its homeland, most of its mounds answered to a single queen. But when the ant crossed into the United States, it left every one of those enemies behind. It arrived in a warm, open land full of food, with nothing around it that knew how to hurt it. For the first time in its history, the fire ant was completely free, and it did exactly what any living thing does when the brakes come off. It exploded. In its new home, something even stranger happened. Mounds that once answered to one queen began sharing dozens of queens at once, and with all of them laying eggs, the colonies packed the ground far denser than they ever had back home. And its biology made that explosion almost impossible to stop. A single fire ant queen can lay 1,500 eggs in a day, every day, for years on end. A colony can replace everything a poison kills faster than any bait program a rancher can afford to spray. That is the real reason the chemicals never worked. You were never fighting the ants you could see. You were fighting a breeding machine buried underground that outproduced you. So, the fire ant conquered Texas not because it was unbeatable, but because it had cheated. It had run away from everything that was meant to keep it in check. But taking the land was only half of what it did, because as the fire ant spread, it quietly erased one of the most remarkable animals Texas ever produced. and most people never even noticed it was gone. The vanishing of the state reptile. That animal is the Texas horned lizard, and if you did not grow up in the state, it is hard to explain how loved this strange little creature is. Flat, round, and covered in spines, no bigger than the palm of your hand. It is the official state reptile, and for generations, it was everywhere. Children caught them in backyards and schoolyards and carried them around in their pockets. And it may have the single strangest defense of any animal in North America. When a coyote or a fox or a dog gets too close, the horned lizard squeezes the blood vessels around its own head until the pressure ruptures tiny vessels behind its eyes, and it fires a jet of its own blood several feet through the air, straight at the attacker. That blood carries a foul-tasting chemical that dogs and coyotes hate, and they stagger back, gagging and shaking their heads. The lizard loses a real share of its own blood doing it, so it saves the trick for the one kind of predator it evolved to scare. Strangely, it will not bother firing at a hawk or a snake. Only at the dogs and coyotes the blood was tuned to disgust. Researchers who wanted to study it struggled for years because the lizards refused to do it on command, and finally had to train a gentle dog to paw at them before the defense would fire. But the blood is only the backup plan. The lizard's real specialty is its diet, and this is where the whole story turns. The Texas horned lizard is an ant-eating specialist, and not just any ant. It lives almost entirely on harvester ants, big, slow, seed-gathering ants, and it needs to eat 60 to 100 of them every single day just to stay alive. Over millions of years, it grew so devoted to this one food that it evolved a resistance to the harvester ant's powerful venom, along with a thick mucus in its throat that traps the ants before they can sting. High-speed cameras later showed just how careful its aim is, striking the safe middle of the ant and swallowing it head first, so the stingers never get a chance. It is a predator built with total precision around a single prey, and that precision, the very thing that made it a marvel, was about to become its death sentence. Because the fire ant does not quietly share a landscape with harvester ants, in facts, it destroys them. The food web pulled out from under it. When fire ants move into an area, they hunt down the harvester ant colonies, overwhelm them with sheer numbers, kill their queens, and take the ground for themselves, often within a single season. And so, across the decades that fire ants spread through central Texas, the harvester ants, the horned lizard's one and only food, collapsed. The lizard had no answer to give. Its whole body was a key cut to fit one lock, and that lock was being destroyed. Nothing in North America had ever wiped out harvester ants across a whole landscape. So, evolution had never handed the lizard a second food to fall back on. And the fire ants did not only starve it, they swarmed its nests and ate its eggs and its newborn young, killing off the next generation before it could even hatch. So, when the harvester ants vanished, the lizard stopped breeding, then stopped surviving, pasture by pasture, corridor by corridor. Then people made it worse without ever meaning to. In the rush to kill fire ants, ranchers and towns sprayed broadcast poisons across the land. And those poisons did not only kill fire ants, they killed the native harvester ants too. Some landowners even mistook the native harvester ants for the invaders and wiped them out on purpose, poisoning the exact species their own state reptile needed to live. People who were sure they were fighting the fire ant were quietly starving the lizard instead. And so, it disappeared. Not in a sudden crash, but in a slow fade that almost no one noticed while it was happening. The children who once caught horned lizards by the handful grew up, and their own children never saw a single one outside a photograph. There was no single year that it ended. The lizard just went from common to uncommon to rare, to gone across most of the state that had made it a symbol. For a long time, it looked final, a native icon, erased by an invader it could never fight. Its food web pulled out from under it. But the story does not end there, because two very different things were about to arrive back on the Texas landscape, and both of them had the fire ant squarely in their sights. The first one came back on purpose, and it is the stuff of nightmares. The flies that came back. If the fire ant's great trick was leaving its enemies behind in South America, then the obvious counterattack was to go and bring those enemies back. And in the 1990s, that is exactly what scientists at the United States Department of Agriculture and the University of Texas set out to do. They went hunting down in the fire ant's homeland for its natural-born killers. And what they found was the phorid fly. The phorid fly is tiny, even smaller than the ant it hunts, but what it does is genuinely horrifying. The female hovers over a fire ant trail, picks out a single target, and darts down to inject one egg into the ant's body in a fraction of a second. The ant does not die. It walks away, seemingly fine. But inside it, that egg hatches, and the larva crawls up into the ant's head and begins to eat, slowly, over about 2 weeks, feeding on the muscle and the brain. And then, the ant changes. It leaves the safety of the colony and wanders off alone, aimless and confused, no longer doing any work for the mound at all, carrying its parasite to a quiet place to finish. Scientists call this the zombie stage, and it is exactly what it sounds like. The ant is still alive, still walking, but it is being driven from the inside by the thing that is eating its head. Finally, the larva releases an enzyme that dissolves the neck from within, and the ant's head simply falls off. The fly grows to adulthood inside the severed head, then climbs out to begin the whole cycle again. Starting in the early 2000s, the government released these flies across the South, including Texas, and they have been spreading on their own ever since, at 10 to 15 miles a year. They do not kill huge numbers of ants outright, but they do something almost more useful. When the flies are around, the fire ants are so terrified that whole foraging columns freeze in place, curl up, or bolt back underground, rather than risk the tiny killer hovering above. Their raiding grinds to a halt, which finally gives the native ants a fighting chance to hold their territory. Before a single fly was ever set loose, the government tested them exhaustively to be sure they would attack only fire ants and leave native species completely alone. 6 different kinds have now taken hold across the South, and roadside surveys suggest fire ant numbers today sit lower than they did back in the 1990s, before the flies arrived. The flies were the counterattack Texas planned for, but the thing that truly shocked the scientists was the counterattack that nobody planned at all. The zoo that rebuilt a lizard. While those flies were spreading, a very different rescue was taking shape at the Fort Worth Zoo. In 2011, a team there set out to do something no one had ever managed: breed the Texas horned lizard in captivity and then put it back into the wild. The animal had been in decline for so long that nobody even knew how to keep it alive and breeding indoors. The team had to invent the entire process from scratch. Part of the reason so many people were willing to try was simple. Texans loved this animal, and ranchers across the state kept calling the zoo, begging for lizards to be put back on their land. The first attempts failed. When they released grown lizards into new land, the animals had no idea where to hide, and predators picked them off almost at once. So, the team changed the plan. Instead of adults, they began releasing tiny hatchlings, barely the size of a coin, small enough to slip under a pebble and vanish into cover before anything could find them. Slowly, the survival numbers started to climb. They worked out something else that mattered enormously. Scientists at Texas Christian University studied the lizard's genetics and found that there was not one Texas horned lizard, but 3 distinct populations across the state, each one tuned to its own region. Drop the wrong one into the wrong habitat, and it might not carry the traits it needed to survive, so every release had to be matched carefully to the land. And crucially, they did not just release lizards. They rebuilt the world the lizard needed, using careful, targeted poison to knock the fire ants back at each release site, while sparing the native harvester ants, so the lizard's food supply could grow again. Piece by piece, it worked. By 2021, hatchlings released a couple of years earlier did something no reintroduced horned lizard had ever done before. They bred in the wild, entirely on their own. By 2025, the zoo had hatched its 2,000th lizard, and in one record season, working with a handful of other zoos and wildlife centers, it released more than 600 hatchlings at once. So the native icon was slowly clawing its way back, one hand-raised hatchling at a time. But here is where the story takes the turn nobody saw coming. Because out in a few wild pastures, far from any zoo release, A wildlife biologist was staring at survey numbers that had stopped making any sense at all. The numbers that did not add up. The biologist had been counting fire ant mounds on the same stretch of the Edwards Plateau for 9 years, and she knew that land was cold. So when the fire ant numbers in 3 particular pastures began dropping season after season, with no one spraying anything, it stopped her in her tracks. She checked the rainfall. She checked the soil. She checked whether any neighbor had secretly baited the land without telling her. Every ordinary explanation came back empty. Something was suppressing the fire ants, and it was not a chemical, and it was not a person. When she mapped what was different about those exact pastures, one thing lined up perfectly. They sat right beside a protected corridor of limestone that had been fenced off from cattle and predators for over a decade, for reasons that had nothing to do with fire ants at all. And into that protected ground, on its own, with no help from any program, the Texas horned lizard had come back. The zones with the most lizards were the very zones where the fire ants were fading. One still morning, sitting at the edge of the limestone outcrop, she counted 7 horned lizards across a single stretch of pasture, in a place where her own records from years earlier had logged not a single one. Now, the obvious guess is that the lizards were simply eating the fire ants. But horned lizards cannot handle fire ant venom the way they handle harvester ant venom, so they mostly leave them alone. The real explanation is stranger, and it works through the harvester ants. By feeding steadily on a harvester ant colony, the lizard appears to keep that colony small and tightly packed, instead of thinly stretched across a wide, weak territory. And a small, tightly defended harvester ant colony is far better at holding its ground against invading fire ants than a big, sprawling one. So, the lizard was not attacking the fire ants directly at all. It was strengthening the native ants that fight the fire ants for ground, tipping a war between 2 ant species that had been grinding on for decades. A creature the size of a credit card, just by showing up every morning and eating its breakfast, was doing something to the balance of that land that 40 years of poison had never touched. And the strangest part is what that kind of pressure adds up to over time. The predator that never runs out. Think about what makes this so different from every poison that came before it. A bait program works for a season, then the ants flood back, so you have to pay to do the whole thing over again, forever. The lizard does not work like that. It shows up to the same ant trail every single morning. It never needs to be reapplied. It does not run out of funding, and it does not stop when a budget dries up. Best of all, it makes more of itself. The pressure it puts on the fire ants does not reset at the end of a season. It builds quietly, year after year, on its own. But before this turns into a fairy tale, look hard at the size of the problem. The fire ant invasion covers 30 million acres of Texas. The protected corridors where the lizard has clawed its way back are measured only in the hundreds of acres. A reptile that weighs less than 2 ounces is not going to reconquer a landscape that stretches from the Gulf Coast to the Red River, not on its own, and not quickly. So it comes down to a race, and the 2 sides are wildly uneven. The lizard and the fly are gaining ground slowly, corridor by corridor, mile by mile, with new genetic research now racing to find fresh ways to hit the fire ant where it breeds. But every acre they win is dwarfed by the tens of millions where the fire ant still rules, where the food web is still being torn apart, and nothing stands against it at all. Every protected pasture the recovery reaches is a foothold. Everything past its edge is still enemy ground. The question comes down to simple speed, whether all of these native forces can spread fast enough and link up soon enough to matter across an invasion this enormous before even more of the land is lost. It is a strange kind of hope, resting not on some new invention, but on an old animal just being allowed to do its ancient job again. Nobody thinks a single lizard saves Texas, but something important is being proven in those 3 quiet pastures. Left alone long enough, in the right conditions, the living land can rebuild what chemistry never could. The fire ant won by running from its enemies, and now, 1 fly and 1 lizard at a time, its enemies are coming home. So, tell me, which do you believe wins this race in the end? The invader that conquered 30 million acres, or the small, stubborn native creatures that simply refuse to stay gone? because the state reptile of Texas was written off for 40 years. It came back on its own, and it is already doing the one thing that no one else ever could: